Well, good afternoon, or good evening, or even good morning, depending on where you are in the world and when you are tuning into the Sundman Lecture. My name is Elliot Gruber. I'm the director here at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, and thank you for joining us for the 21st Maynard Sundman Lecture. This year, we are honored to have John Hotchner as our guest speaker. John's subject, A Life in Philately. Several years ago, all of the Smithsonian museums were directed by Secretary Bunch to do three things: to increase reach, to increase relevance, and to increase impact. And thanks to the incredible team here at the National Postal Museum, we've been doing all three. In increasing reach, 2 years ago, we reached about 760,000 people online. This past year, our number was 1.4 million. Increasing impact. Our education and public programs have received awards and recognition, and the feedback from participants has been extraordinary. In terms of increasing relevance, this past August, we opened up an exhibit in our National Stamp Salon called A History of Voting by Mail. We also opened an expanded version of the exhibit online. Media impressions have been in the tens of millions. As you can imagine, it was pretty relevant subject matter given our recent election. And right now at the Postal Museum, we're in the midst of reimagining our exhibit experiences. So stay tuned for even more engaging educational experiences that will bring more of our collections out to each one of you. It is now my sincere pleasure to introduce David Sundman, an emeritus member of the museum's Council of Philatelists and the chairman of the board of Littleton Coin Company. David and his brother Don established the Maynard Sundman Lecture Series in 2002 to honor their father, Maynard. Maynard Sundman began collecting stamps in 1927, and at the age of only 19 started his first philatelic business, selling stamps through the mail. His passion for stamps continued throughout his lifetime. The lecture series allows the Sundman family and the National Postal Museum to share this passion with a broader audience by featuring talks by authors and expert philatelists. On a personal note, I have worked with David's brother Don for more than 7 years here at the Postal Museum, during which time he was the chair of the Council of Philatelists. Don has also been a very valued mentor and advisor to me. But actually, it was David who I first came into contact with, and I'm not sure if you know this, and that was when I was in high school. I didn't really know David then, but I was a regular purchaser from the Littleton Coin Company. So I'm really pleased that our paths have crossed again, David. Thank you again to you and to Don for supporting the Maynard Sundman Lecture Series and for joining us today.
Well, thank you, and it's nice to see all of you and be with you in person. 2 years ago I did this, but by Zoom, and this is much more interesting and exciting. Thanks to Elliot, the Smithsonian staff, and the Postal Museum for hosting this for the 21st time. I'll tell you a little bit about how my dad got started with collecting. He was never a scholar, but what he really he enjoyed stamps, and he enjoyed selling stamps to collectors. And he started in 1927, the year that Charles Lindbergh flew to Paris. And my dad found that collecting stamps really was a way to travel the world with an imagination. And you pick up a stamp from Liberia or Zanzibar, or Tanatuva, I mean, boom, you're out there. And he started by telling his dad that he only wanted to collect one stamp from every country. And that seemed like a reasonable goal to my grandfather. And so he was off, and he started his business in the living room of his family home. My grandfather mortgaged, this is during the middle of the Depression, in 1930s, he took out another mortgage on the house to give my dad some additional capital. The biggest thing was that my dad went to Typex in New York City in 1936 And H.E. Harrison Company, who were advertising stamp dealing kits that my father had answered an ad, they had a table at the show. And my father recognized Stephen Harris, who's H.E.'s brother, and H.E. from the catalogs. And he was the world's largest stamp dealer. He started in 1916, and he really taught my dad how to be a successful stamp dealer. And I remember being a teenager, and we had the run of the H.E. Harris inventory. The deal was my father, H.E. wouldn't give you cash to back you. And you couldn't go to a bank and say, I want to be a stamp dealer. They'd laugh you out of the room. But H.E. backed 5 dealers, Kenmore, Garceland, Mystic, and a couple others, Littleton. And the deal was that you had to buy your stamps from him, your inventory. So all of our stamps that we sold when I was a kid, they would come from H.E. Harrison Company. And it was a great business, and we were lucky to know him. My dad, in the 1930s, he was probably the biggest fan of the post office in Bristol, Connecticut. As soon as he saw the postman coming down the street, First Street, he would rush up to him and get the postman to give him his mail, because he'd sent away for all these approvals to all the stamp dealers all over the country. So here's actually a photocopy of a 1930 envelope from Edward Fleeter of Seattle, Washington, dealers in coins and stamps from all over the world. And he's sending it to Maynard Sundman on First Street in Bristol, Connecticut. At any rate, life went on, and my dad went into the service, got out, started the business again in New Hampshire. And that's where we are now. We're just coins. In 1974, he bought Mystic Stamp Company. My brother, Don, quit college at the age of 19 and went over there to build it into probably one of the leading stamp dealers in the world. And we both sold our businesses to our employees. But fortunately, they let me have a desk, and they let Don have an office. And so we have someplace to go, and we don't get in the way of our wives. So, and Don is vacationing with his family in Botswana and Namibia right now. And so he said, I think you should do the talk this year. So here I am. And I always enjoy wearing this tie, and it's great to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, and to your brother Don and the rest of the Sundman family for supporting this wonderful lecture series for over 2 decades. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming and joining us online and in person. I'm Dr. Susan Smith. I'm the Winton and Blunt Research Chair here at the National Postal Museum. Before I introduce John Hotchner, I want to tell you a little bit about how this program will work, since it is a hybrid program. For those of you online on Zoom, this is a webinar, which means you will not have the use of your microphones or your cameras. Any technical problems and any questions can go into the Q&A box, and closed captioning is available. You'll see a CC or closed captioning at the bottom of your screen if you opt to use that. After the lecture, we will have time for questions. Because this is being recorded, we want to make sure that those of you in the room with questions have a microphone, so please wait until I get to you. And that way people at home will be able to hear you, and it'll be in the recording. And for those of you that are writing in your questions, my colleague Dan Piazza will gather those questions and ask them also on a microphone for the room so that everybody can hear them. It's now my immense pleasure to introduce you to John M. Hotchner, this year's Maynard Sundman Lecturer. I think many of you know him. For nearly 50 years as a writer, John has encouraged collectors to become more involved in philately, and he has himself participated in nearly every aspect of the hobby. He's been collecting since the age of 5. He has a very wide range of interests, as I think you're going to hear. He began writing for Linz in 1976, and he's published over 3,000 articles in both specialty and philatelic international and national publications. One of the things that I did not know is that from 1984 to 1993, John was the writer-editor of the U.S. Postal Service's monthly publications for children called Stamp Fund and Leader Feature. For over 1 million grade school and junior high students participating in over 48,000 Benjamin Franklin stamp clubs nationwide. In 1986, he co-founded with Randy Neal the American Association of Philatelic Exhibitors, and then served 24 years as the editor of its quarterly, The Philatelic Exhibitor. His own exhibits have been shown in numerous courts of honor at the American Philatelic Society, the World Series of Philately, and international shows. He is, in addition to being a competitive exhibitor, also an accredited philatelic, accredited literature, and a chief judge who has headed juries in national and international shows. In 1998, Postmaster General Runyon appointed him to the Citizen Stamps Advisory Committee, which is the group that selects the subjects for American stamps. He served the maximum 12 years and was in the process and helped select the subjects for over 1,700 American stamps. He has served on the board at the National Postal Museum's Council of Philatelists. Was a member of that council from 2002 to 2017, is now an emeritus member. He served the American Philatelic Society for 16 years in various capacities, including serving as president. And he has served on the boards of more than 20 other organizations. He has received prestigious awards for both service to philately and for philatelic literature. And they include awards from the APS, the Collectors Club of New York, the U.S. Philatelic Classics Society, and the Philatelic Foundation. In 2017, he was elected to the role of Distinguished Philatelist, and in 2023, he was honored with the Smithsonian Philatelic Achievement Award. Please join me in welcoming John Hotchner.
Thank you very much, Susan. Forget all that stuff. I'm just having fun. That's what philately is about. And I hope that you enjoy this and you have fun with the hobby as well. I want to start off by saying that philately is a socially transmitted disease. I caught it from my father. Whoop. That. Bingo. Name is Howard Hotchner, and he was a committed collector all his life. I may be well known in the hobby, but he beat me by a country mile. He was the co-founder of the Voice of America Stamp Club and wrote the scripts telling the stories behind new American stamps in the 1940s and 1960s. He was also one of the announcers that then brought those stories to literally millions of listeners worldwide, making friends for the USA during the heights, or perhaps I should say the depths of the Cold War. Over 500,000 foreigners from all continents, including from the Soviet bloc, signed up as members of the Voice of America Stamp Club. In 1954, at the age of 11, we moved to India so he could take up his duties as VOA liaison to All India Radio. I was 12 when we both joined the New Delhi Stamp Club, and I committed an unpardonable sin. With my weekly 5 rupees allowance, about $1 at that time, burning a hole in my pocket, I bid against him in a club auction for a small group of rupee value definitives. We were sitting in different parts of the room, so I didn't know I was bidding against him, but I found out later, and that he was pretty frosted about it. I suspect he thought he'd created a monster. That took a while to resolve, but it led to our dividing up the world so we would not be chasing the same material. From the age of 13 and back in the USA, my dad taught me how to do a lot of the busy work with his collections, washing stamps off paper, sorting, cataloging, watermarking, making exchange books. Bingo. Making exchange books for our local stamp club, which he'd founded, and more. All of this provided not only a steady, if modest, income, but a thorough grounding in the basics of philately, and not incidentally, stamps from my own collection, too. This allowed him to do the things he especially enjoyed, answering VOA Stamp Club reader mail, making pages for his albums, and helping his friend Ernie Kerr, who was the New York Herald Tribune stamp columnist. Ernie was also the founder of Stamps for the Wounded, which I work with today, and he may be known to many of you as the author of the classic, The Romance of Stamp Collecting. Around the age of 16, I discovered women. I never let schoolwork get in the way of my stamp collecting activities, but women, that was a whole different story. That, without going into detail, curtailed my stamping and my investing in my collecting. But I never left the hobby completely. I kept my collection all the way through school at the then all-male University of Virginia, and through other distractions such as a job with the US State Department, and then marriage and parenting. Looking back, I'm convinced my wife, prior to the wedding, thought that she would cure me of philately. That's not how it worked out. Before long, I was back at it with gusto, involved in the local club, and being forced out of my shell. I've always been shy, you'd never know that, and the thought of giving a talk, being a club leader, or writing for publication was terrifying. I credit the now sadly shuttered Dolly Madison Stamp Club of McLean, Virginia, for my years of philatelic and personal development. There, I learned how to tap my hidden resources and capabilities to do the things that I hadn't known I could do. I might even have become a bit overconfident. One day I thought to myself, I like to write. I follow what's happening in the hobby and have opinions. Why not offer to write a column for Lin's, the biggest and best publication in the hobby? So in 1976, I wrote to Lin's editor, sending a few of the samples of my work. It never occurred to me that I was applying to start at the top of the philatelic publication pyramid. The sheer presumptuousness of it amazes me today. But the editor wrote back and said, sure, how about a monthly column to start with? And he even offered me the magnificent sum of $10 per column. I was hooked, and that's how my first column, titled My Corner of the World, eventually was published. And it eventually morphed into The Philatelic Philosopher, which I pretty much consider myself today, though I had to give up that moniker. And that eventually morphed into the weekly U.S. Stamp Notes column on page 6 of Lin's each week. So here we are 50 years from when I began to write columns for my local stamp club. Looking back, it's been a great ride, offering opportunities to learn, being privileged to rub shoulders with the contemporary greats of the hobby, and to get involved in some of the organizations and groups trying to move the hobby and its institutions forward. How did writing for Lin's lead to those activities? Being published on a regular basis, I became a known quantity in the hobby. This can be good or bad. For me, it was mostly good. My interests and opinions were in black and white, and readers with projects, common interests, thoughts on what could make the hobby better, or offices to fill, would write or phone, or later email, some with confirming or contrary opinions, others with offers and suggestions. I like opportunities, so I accepted many of the offers. Giving talks, working to promote philatelic organizations, starting new groups, special writing assignments like doing the materials for the Ben Franklin Stamp Club program from the 80s into the 90s. All of those came my way. In other words, one thing led to another, and eventually my plate was full, and I had what the old cartoon character Pogo used to call insurmountable opportunities. Eventually, painful as it was, I even had to learn to say no. In the midst of all this embarrassment of riches, I also focused on several subjects for my Linz column that readers seemed especially interested in. Among these have been living people on U.S. stamps, which runs counter to the plain language of an 1866 law, but that's another story for another day. And U.S. postal counterfeits created to divert revenue from the Postal Service. I also got a fair number of questions on the technical aspects of U.S. stamp production and how errors came about, which led to a whole new group of contacts. Most notably, some of you will recall the exceptional George Brett and a continuing relationship with the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. It also afforded me an opportunity to do significant research on U.S. stamp production and the chance to make new philatelic discoveries, which of course became fodder for my Linz column. I also delved into Christmas-related philately, which, as it developed, seemed to appeal to a lot of collectors and readers. In addition, I got into the general subject of expertizing, another area that generated a lot of questions and experiences from readers. Expertizing actually got popular enough to be split off into its own monthly column, currently in Scott's Stamp Monthly. Add in my monthly cartoon caption contest, and those subjects account for about 2/3 of the reader mail that I get. And I take a certain amount of pride that I respond to every bit of reader mail that I get. One of the subjects, U.S. postal counterfeits, became a non-competitive exhibit in 2002. Correspondence resulting from my Linz columns on the subject identified two others who were serious collectors in this area, Rich Drews and Joanne Linz. We agreed to pool our material to make an exhibit that we both hoped would educate and publicize the specialty and lead to more reports. It was non-competitive because the exhibiting rules required that all the material in a competitive exhibit be the property of the exhibitor. We showed it at the annual APS shows and a few others. It was successful enough that the Scott Catalog folks came to me in 2012 to ask that I prepare a new section for the U.S. specialized on U.S. postal counterfeits. That debuted in the 2013 catalog, and now, thanks to the People's Republic of China, Scott is now publishing a separate catalog on this regrettably fast-growing area. And I'll tell you, they're about to do an update of this. It's going to be twice the size because the Chinese are reproducing, counterfeiting virtually every U.S. stamp issued. A moment is needed for definitions. Some collectors use the terms fake, forgery, and counterfeit interchangeably. Each is its own thing. Fakes are defined as altering a genuine stamp to make it appear to be something of greater value. For example, repairing faults, altering colors, or the fine details that differentiate one design type from another, or adding or removing cancellations. These are dangerous, but like forgeries, they're aimed at trying to fool collectors into spending money on stamps that appear to be genuine but aren't. Forgeries are labels that have been created to appear to be genuine stamps, either to credibly reproduce genuine valuable stamps or to produce something that looks like it might be a genuine stamp but never existed as such. The bottom stamps are obvious, but the top one, the stamp is genuine, the cover is fake. Postal counterfeits, on the other hand, have been created by small-time criminals, organized crime, and more recently with the connivance of foreign governments to closely match current U.S. stamps with the object of selling them at a discount for use as genuine stamps in the mail stream, thus depriving the postal authorities of revenue. My particular interest is in the period 1895 to 2004, the point at which foreign producers of U.S. postal counterfeits shifted into high gear and began to import their product in massive quantities, representing hundreds of millions of dollars, and distributing them via the internet. In the period to 2004, I subsequently bought out Rich Drews and Joanne Lenz, and with the addition of material that's come on the market, it's now a competitive exhibit in 5 frames and has won large golds. Let me show you a few of my favorite items from the exhibit. What you see is the little sheet in the middle there is how these stamps were produced. They were done in cliches of 5, perforated that way, and then released in Chicago. Not happy with the idea that just stamps could be counterfeited. There was a gentleman in Chicago who took the current postal card and manufactured literally hundreds of thousands of these, of which there are about 30 known these days. There are 5 different design types, and these are a couple of them. They are listed in the Scott catalog. Now, everybody knows the Zeppelin series that the United States produced. This is the high value, and the genuine is the one in the middle. The 4 around it are all different versions of fakes, and the one at the bottom is a really poor fake, but the 4 that are shown are really quite good. Although they differ a bit in inking, they differ a bit in perforations. This is one where it doesn't really quite fit the mold because the half-cent stamps, which you can see are not very good versions of the genuine, which are at the bottom. These were done by North Korea, and they weren't done for circulation in the United States. They were done to fool people in South Korea into thinking that material that the North Koreans were sending, propaganda, had been done in the United States. There are exactly 3 of these covers known. This one belonged to Clyde Jennings, for some of you who will know that name. And I am feeling really very lucky to have been able to get this. This is one where if you know a little bit about philately, that's really all you need to know that the fakes are fake. The 13-cent Liberty Bell was issued in booklets and in coil form, which means that every last one that's genuine has at least one imperf side. If you look at the bottom piece, they are perforated all around. Have to be fake. The printing isn't all that awful, but there is that tell. The perils of producing high-value stamps in black and white. The 3 stamps at the top, one is genuine, that's the one in the middle. The ones on the outside are fakes that were done, forgeries, counterfeits that were done using your friendly local Xerox machine and a home perforator. The counterfeiters don't always get it right. On the right is a genuine booklet of 10 stamps. The counterfeiters made these too big, the stamps themselves, and then made booklet panes that were twice basically the size of what they should have been. This was an operation that was rolled up before the stamps were distributed, and there are none known on cover. But I like to find these things on cover, and this is one that is actually the last page of my exhibit, because it's the point at which the Postal Service threw up its hands and said, we can't deal with this and we're not going to. This is one of the few covers that I have found that say evidence of counterfeit postage. And instead of rolling this back and trying to find out where the sender got them and put the people in the clink, they simply sent it back to the sender and said, the stamps aren't any good, put a good one on here. The cover at the bottom, they had thrown up their hands. That's a counterfeit, and they did absolutely nothing about it. This exhibit is in process of being reproduced in book form with an additional section on other ways that the public has found to try to slip mail through the system using exhibiting rules that required that all material, oops, sorry, I missed that. I have, okay, here we go. The second part of the exhibit is what's called stamp substitutes, thereby reducing USPS revenue. There are a few of these from my exhibit of what I'll call postal larceny. Here's one where the Postal Service, when they were issuing penny stamps, found that sometimes the penny stamps were being misidentified as dollar stamps. So they figured if they put 01 on the stamp instead of just 1, that would take care of the problem. What they got was enterprising people who turned the stamps upside down so that they look like 10-cent stamps, and people actually got away with this. It amazes me that anybody would bother to do this, but these are postal currency stamps that were either used as stamps or, in one case, in the top case, somebody actually cut the stamp picture out of the postal currency and used that. Okay, everybody knows what American stamps look like, right? Well, on top is a German stamp used for US postage, and on the bottom is a Nigerian airport tax stamp used for postage. And both of these got through. Talk about enterprising. At one point, the Postal Service decided to expand their market by putting out notepads with stamp pictures on them. Somebody folded the notepad sheets and made envelopes out of them, sent them through the mail. They weren't caught. This got the Postal Service to undo that. Okay, here's one where somebody had way too much time on their hands. The stamp at the top is a "Don't Tread on Me" 6-cent stamp from 1968, a series of 10 different Revolutionary War stamps. The, quote, stamp on the envelope, which made it through the Postal Service, says, "Don't mess with me," and is hand-drawn, and, you know, not an uncredible job of it. I've been asked if it's legal to collect counterfeits. Strictly speaking, the answer is no. Possession is banned by law, and in earlier times, this was enforced against dealers and collectors. Today, the Postal Inspection Service has its hands full with counterfeiters and marketers of current forever stamps, not to mention using the mails to distribute controlled narcotics and another dozen different violations of law. The result is they've made a decision not to prosecute collectors of the older material. It's clearly not a threat to current revenue. I think it's a positive, as the older counterfeits are part of the story of the stamps they replicate and deserve to be studied and made part of collections. Counterfeits is perhaps the most public example of my collecting activities, but over the years I've covered hundreds of subjects relating to U.S. stamps and started collections of most of them. So I never have a problem finding material to buy when I visit a stamp show. And I've also decided to do at least one new exhibit every year, and am now on about the 23rd of those that have either been shown or are in development. In this way, the hobby never gets stale. A question people often ask is, how do you keep up so many columns in different publications and your range of philatelic activities? They're usually happy with a brief answer, which is that I'm organized, don't need a lot of sleep, and enjoy learning. In fact, I feel like I get more from the hobby than I give. With your permission, I'd like to expand on that a bit, hoping that the longer form answer might resonate with others who want to get more involved. First, my parents had an incredible work ethic. That model translated itself for me to a sign I've had on my wall for 60 years, going back to my university days. It says simply, "Do something." I'm rarely not doing something. Some people relax by being a couch potato. I relax by reading, spending time on my collections, planning an exhibit, writing, or expertising. I love what I do. It's not work. Second, I love to learn. No one can know everything about everything in philately, but I'm determined to try. I am well organized. My wife would bring friends down to the basement so they could see what she had to put up with. I agree, it's pretty jammed. Books, clipping files, albums, etc. And that's only about a quarter of what the basement looks like. But despite the evident clutter, the basement is neat. And what's important is that I can find almost anything, be it a specific stamp or a bit of information needed for a column, in minutes. It contributes to my columns and my organizational work that my thought process is based on the question, how can we accomplish X, rather than the too common, why I can't accomplish X. In addition, I put myself and my feelings into my columns. Many, I'd say even most writers who write in philately just stick to the facts of what they're writing about. My orientation opens up much wider areas for discussion, inquiry, and, may I say, a dash of humor. I don't write treatises or screeds. Well, rarely. Rather, I work to be respectful of the reader and to engage him or her, asking for opinions, questions, additional information or examples I may not be aware of. One positive of this is I often get input that turns into more columns. It's true that I really don't need a lot of sleep. I sleep when I need to, but it's rarely more than an average of about 5 hours a day. And some of my most productive time is when others in the house are sleeping. Deadlines are a scourge to many writers. I love them. Much of what I write probably would not be written except that I know I have a deadline to meet. I'm usually well ahead of them, so they're not looming doom as they may be for others. The process of writing is to me exciting. I usually sit down at the computer with a germ of an idea, and it's exciting to see how it expands and develops. I often say that what I write comes through me rather than from me, and there's enormous satisfaction in seeing a finished project, be it a column, an exhibit, or an updated album. I don't aim for perfection in my written products. Yes, I do edit, but there comes a time when additional editing is not worth the time it takes. If I know the facts are accurate, it's time to send it to the editor and let nature take its course. Finally, I'm not one to be constantly checking the New York Times style manual for rules of syntax and grammar. I believe in personal style, and mine may be a bit unorthodox, but I don't lose any sleep over it. My standard is clarity, not blind conformance to someone else's rules. I'd add that I enjoy working with people and find them endlessly fascinating, informative, and inspirational. I could never be a closet collector. For me, if there's anything better than personal accomplishment, it's collaborating as a pair or group to accomplish something. In my remaining time, let me summarize 6 things I've learned living as a philatelist. I'm not exceptional. We all have capabilities that we can develop if we're willing to think positive, take a chance, and put in the work. Second, the hobby is broad and deep. I've never met a collector who was boring or bored. Stamp collecting enriches the life of a collector, youth or adult. It's a path to painless learning and an education in art appreciation. It provides, if temporarily as we spend time with our collections, a sense of control in a disordered world. Time passes when you're having fun, and having fun is what Philately is all about. I believe the relaxation it provides and the goals we set that get us out of bed every morning act to add years to a stamp collector's life. The hobby is its people, and enjoying the hobby in clubs and societies is a treat. Stamp collectors in these groups are equals. Race, gender, occupation, financial status are of no importance to our interest in stamps. And finally, if I may return to what I said at the start of this presentation, philately is a social disease. It is most successfully passed from one person to another. Whether you are one who introduces the hobby to another, you're a model for a new collector, a mentor, a source of stamps for a newbie, you are helping to assure the future of our hobby, and I thank you. All right, I guess we have time for a few questions.
Thank you so much for your contributions to the, I'm over here. Thank you so much for your contributions to the hobby. I've known of you long before I've gotten to know you. So you talked about how you have, how stamp collecting is a social disease and that you picked it up from your father. Have you been successful in getting your children involved? And I brought a 5-year-old, mine, so I think I've given him a cold, and I've given him COVID, and I've probably given him a tummy ache, but I don't know that I've gotten him to become a collector. How am I going to do that?
I wish I could tell you. I have 4 children, as you probably saw in the photo. Each of them got to the point of doing exhibits, ages, let's say 8 to 12 or 13. They all dropped out. I hope that as they age, and they're getting to that time of life where they have extra time and disposable income, and they might come back to the hobby. But it is the rare individual who starts as a kid and continues their whole life. I did, but it's not the usual pattern. People get to the age of retirement and look about for something that they might get involved in. And for those people who had a fling at stamp collecting as a kid and enjoyed it, that's a natural way to go. But I think everybody has a collecting gene, but not everybody goes in the direction of philately. There are people who collect art, people who collect dishes, people who collect birds. My wife was one of those who said, well, I don't collect anything, but if you look around our house, you see all these little bird statues.
What about expanding it out? A couple of trends that I've noticed over the last, say, 20 years is expanding it out in terms of women, because it tends to be a male-dominated hobby, and particularly Denise and Jay Stotts, for example. And Denise came in as a topical collector and
Right.
going in that direction, so getting more women involved, and also horizontally in terms of international collectors, people of different ethnic backgrounds. It has tended to be a male, white-dominated audience, but African Americans or Chinese Americans. Chinese have not only a negative but a very positive contribution to the hobby these days and bring a lot of dynamism. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, one of my campaigns, if you have read my stuff over the course of years, is to try to get more women involved in the hobby. I think when we were coming up, that was a hard sell because women were responsible for raising the children and doing the housework and so forth. There wasn't a lot of time left. That's changing a bit as men take on more responsibilities, and I think that's a good thing. But something like this takes a lot of time. Some way has to be found to make it fun, not more work. And the work that I did with the Ben Franklin Stamp Club, and I have some of those, I showed an example, but I have some of those things that I did for the Ben Franklin kids that really do appeal to kids, and I would be happy to give you some of my extras. You also may have noticed on the cover of one that there was not only Stan the Answer Stamp, who was present when I took over that assignment, but also Natalie Philately became part of that enterprise, and that was my creation. So I agree with you. More women by all means. More minorities of any kind. More, absolutely.
I have a question. The current forever flag stamps, is there a way to tell that the novice can look at the stamp and determine it's a forgery? A dozen years ago, the flag stamp was being counterfeited in China, and they made a mistake. They didn't put the year in the corner, the lower right corner. It's microprint. You could see it with a magnifier, but the fakes didn't have it, so you quickly knew what was a fake and what wasn't if you're going to order some. The best advice, buy from the Postal Service, then you're safe. Because the Postal Service says they won't deliver a letter with a fake on it, with a counterfeit. But well, is there a way to tell the difference? We're being flooded with them. They're on eBay. You can buy $100 worth of stamps there for $50 if you feel like doing it. But why will it be a genuine stamp? The odds. What is your opinion? What can be done and what to look for on a current stamp? Thanks.
Well, I think if you have access to the Scott Specialized U.S. catalog, I did that section, and in every case, including up to current publication, there is information about what's different on the counterfeit than the genuine stamp. So there is that resource. The book that I will be releasing, hopefully in the next 3 months or so, will also have some of that information, but for the older stamps. You've highlighted the problem very well. The marketers for the counterfeits are not dummies. They have improved the product. For instance, up through 2004, they didn't use any tagging on stamps. Very easy, put a black light on the stamp. If it doesn't have any tagging, it's a counterfeit. They now do tagging. They now use the proper color inks. They now include the microprinting, although sometimes in the wrong places. And the buyers are often low-income people who, the counterfeiters, as they advertise, say, we were lucky enough to get a whole warehouse full of postage stamps from a company that went out of business. We don't need all these stamps. If you want some of these, buy them for half price. And so people in good faith, not just people who know they're buying counterfeits, and there are plenty of them too. Those people are out there doing it to the Postal Service, and the Postal Service, I will reveal my objections, really let it happen. They have shot themselves in the foot in the worst possible way, and their answer about a year and a half ago was, well, we'll pick all the counterfeit stamps out on letter mail, and we'll destroy the letter mail. I asked them the question, what if your granny is paying her water bill, and there are going to be a lot of people doing that, and you throw away their payment? Can you imagine the havoc that would be created in the financial system by doing that? Well, the Postal Service said, well, maybe we'll think about that. They put it in the regulations, but they've not enforced it. What they've got to do is they have, we've got to energize the White House to talk to the Chinese government about this and get it stopped. Unfortunately, fentanyl is a bigger issue, and the White House has to worry about that too. So, this is a conundrum that I don't think is going to get solved anytime soon. I wish it were otherwise, but it's not.
John, enjoyed your talk very much. I wanted to ask you a question because it was recently, I believe, I read it in Lynn's, forgive me if I'm wrong, but the UK has come out with some kind of a scanner to determine what's legitimate on the stamp and what is not. Could you comment on that?
The UK has done a couple of things. On their definitives, they put little cutouts, parallel bars at the bottom of the Queen stamps, so that they could not be reused, and they were obviously fakes if those things weren't there. Excuse me. And that helped a bit, but it hasn't stopped it. So they came up with another wonderful idea. On all of their definitives, they put a barcode. And they said at point X, only stamps with barcodes would be valid for postage. Counterfeiters started counterfeiting the barcodes successfully. So again, there ain't no easy answer.
They said that they were going to actually find the person who mailed the letter with any bad postage and actually physically find them.
Well, you can do that, but that's a buyer. That's not the producer. You got to get at the producers. You got to get at the shippers. You got to get at the people who are running the internet sites. Again, not so easy.
Thank you so much for sharing so much about your work today. I was curious in the introduction, I hope I have this right, the name of it. I was curious to hear about your time on the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee. And I think that's such an interesting project and thing to conceptualize. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to speak about what the priorities were and whether you ever had any submissions, what kind of submissions you were rejecting, what ones you were attracted to, and what guidelines govern those decisions. Thanks.
Okay, boy, this is a big package to open. I was appointed in 1998 because at that time I was the president of the American Philatelic Society, and the one philatelist on the 15-person committee had just retired. And he was kind enough to recommend me, and I was appointed. There were 14 other members. The committee was formed in 1957 and was known and still is known as the Postmaster General's heat shield. You can imagine the number of people who go to the Postmaster General and say, gee, I really think it'd be neat if we had a stamp for the 150th anniversary of the Raccoon Association. And the Postmaster General, talking to a politician who's important, is loath to say, we can't do that. That's a ridiculous recommendation. So what he says is, or she says, is, I'm going to refer that to the committee that I have that picks our stamp subjects. There are somewhere in the order of 30,000 to 50,000 requests a year that come into the Postal Service for postage stamp subjects. There are roughly 30 subjects a year that are chosen. You can imagine there are an awful lot of unhappy people out there. People write long letters, they circularize their congresspeople, they write to their president, they do everything they can think of to influence the committee, but the committee is really not influenceable because the names are public if you go to the Postal Service website, but these are not people who are well known, except sometimes. Henry Louis Gates was a member for a lot of the years that I was on the committee. Digger Phelps, sports personalities, Joan Mondale. But the committee's operation is in secret, specifically so that people can't be bludgeoned to death for not supporting something that somebody thinks ought to get a stamp. The stamp program ought to celebrate the United States. And while I don't like to be critical, I'm going to make an exception. Since I left the committee in 2010, the content of the U.S. stamp program has gone downhill. You see precious little history. You see an amount of DEI, and there's a place for that. You see butterflies, flowers, dogs and cats, all sorts of promotional material for movies and such, even foreign movies, Harry Potter. You don't see very much that's substantive about America anymore. And I think that's a tragedy. It's a misuse of the stamp program. But the Postal Service has its deficits, and the deficits have to be met somehow. And they figure that the more stamps they can sell, the more butterflies, the more dogs and cats, et cetera, that's making a contribution to the bottom line. I wish it weren't so, but it is.
Do you have a number of the amount that the Postal Service is losing every year on counterfeit stamps?
They don't admit to anything, but I have heard that informally, a lady from the inspection service who spoke at the last APS convention owned up to being $300 million in a given year. I'm willing to bet you it's over $1 billion.
And what do you think of the price of stamps today?
To be fair, if you look at the quality of the Postal Service compared to postal services across the world, our stamp price is not only competitive, it's better than most. If you look at the rate of inflation from 1950, when postage was 3 cents, to now, we're actually under the rate of inflation at 73 cents. I don't like the prices, but that's what it is.
Thank you.
Okay, we're at time. Thank you so much, John.